Lots of people tend to think of the President of the United States as being similar to the head of a big corporation, in charge of everything that goes on in this country. But that's not really true. The President is the head of the executive branch of government, and the powers of the President, or executive powers, are laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President's job description, if you want to call it that, includes a role in national security, how the legislature and judicial arm of government work, and the administration of the government. One of the most important roles of the President is Commander-in-Chief of our armed services. He can send troops overseas without declaring war, and he can call the National Guard into federal service. But if he wants to declare war officially, he needs the approval of Congress. The President can recommend legislation to Congress, but he can't write any laws. If he wants to submit a law, he needs to get a member of Congress to do it for him. But even though he can't write laws, he has the power to keep proposals from being made into law with the presidential veto. The President isn't a judge, but he can appoint justices to the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the country, whenever there is a court vacancy during a presidency. These 9 judges are responsible for interpreting federal laws. The President can also grant pardons to people convicted of federal crimes. One controversial executive power the President has is known as executive privilege. Executive privilege is all about information. What kind of information the President and executive branch can keep to themselves for reasons such as protecting national security, and what information the public, including Congress, has a right to know. But nowhere in the Constitution do we actually see the words executive privilege. So what does it really mean? The President's duties are clearly defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution makes it clear that no person, including the President, is above the law. But presidents sometimes argue that not everything they know should be made public, even to members of Congress. That's what happened with President George Washington and the Jay Treaty.
President Washington in 1796 got into a conflict with the House of Representatives. He had recently negotiated a treaty with the British, whereby the British paid Americans for losses during the Revolution and agreed to remove certain troops. And many people were upset with the treaty. They thought they'd given too much away to the British. And members of the House of Representatives want to see documents relating to that treaty, and President Washington says no. He says he doesn't have to give documents to the House because treaties are ratified by the Senate, and he sets a precedent for what we know today as executive privilege, where the President can withhold information on the basis of national security.
President Washington argued that only the Senate approves treaties, so the House of Representatives didn't need the information. He gave the documents to the Senate, but wouldn't share them with the House.
Americans have always been quite suspicious about executive privilege. There's often the idea that politicians and presidents are really trying to cover something up rather than withhold information for national security purposes.
Can executive privilege be used as a way for a president and his staff to get away with breaking the law? Some people worry that it can. In 1974, President Richard M. Nixon was told he had to turn over Oval Office tapes and written records related to a criminal investigation of a break-in at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. But Nixon claimed executive privilege.
The Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to turn over tapes that had been made in the Oval Office, tapes that many people thought would explain to Americans what really happened at Watergate. President Nixon had initially refused to turn over the tapes and some other material. The court instructed him to do it. A few weeks later, he turned over the material, and soon after, he resigns from the presidency.
Is executive privilege even necessary? Recent presidents have used it to prevent their top advisors from testifying before Congress during a number of very controversial events. In addition to Nixon using it during Watergate, Ronald Reagan invoked executive privilege during the Iran-Contra scandal, and Bill Clinton claimed it during the Lewinsky scandal. In the middle of an inquiry conducted by the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States on September 11th, George W. Bush prevented the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice from testifying, claiming executive privilege. What do presidents have to hide anyway? Of course, all presidents are concerned about releasing information that might put our national security at risk. But George Washington might also have argued that executive privilege upholds a very important idea written right into the Constitution. Separation of powers was designed to prevent too much power from being concentrated in any one branch of government, the presidency, Congress, or judicial arm. A president who openly shares every decision would take away from the system of checks and balances.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The guidelines for executive privilege and how it's interpreted today go back to the days of Watergate. In 1974, the Supreme Court decided that although presidents have a right to quote confidential presidential communications, if these communications are needed for a potential criminal trial, they have to be handed over.
President Clinton invoked executive privilege 4 times, and President Reagan had done so about 3 times. Executive privilege becomes an area of controversy during the Clinton years. When Kenneth Starr, the independent prosecutor, is investigating President Clinton, he claims that the president is withholding information that he has to turn over about this investigation into his affair with an intern.
Independent prosecutor Kenneth Starr argued that the very fact that President Clinton claimed executive privilege in this instance was an abuse of power. So, exactly when is executive privilege okay to use, and who can claim it? That's not always clear. During the Clinton administration, First Lady Hillary Clinton argued that she was covered by executive privilege during the Whitewater real estate scandal. The courts rejected her claim.
In 2002, Vice President Cheney argued that the vice president could withhold information on the basis of executive privilege. Democrats wanted information about a secret group he had convened to write the oil laws of the nation involving energy, and Cheney said that he didn't have to turn that over, that this was secret information, and this became an area of contention.
The Supreme Court ended up refusing to order the vice president to turn over his secret records, but they kept the case alive by sending it back to the lower courts. It's not clear how court decisions on future executive privilege cases will go. What is apparent is that the debate over executive privilege and the power of the presidency isn't going to end anytime soon.
Executive privilege has become an area of controversy since Watergate because it's become a symbol of presidential power. So often when we're fighting about a specific case or moment of executive privilege, did a president have the right to withhold information or not, it's not just a debate about that president, it's a debate about the presidency. How much power should the president have in the United States, and what obligations does the president have to Congress, to the courts, and to citizens?
The idea that government should be transparent, meaning citizens are able to ask and get answers about how specific decisions are made, is one that really defines our country. That's what freedom of the press is all about too. We want to be able to ask questions and get straight answers from our leaders about what they're doing. But few would argue that there are times when opening up the Oval Office puts security at risk. President George W. Bush invoked executive privilege for the first time in his administration to block a congressional committee. It was trying to review documents about a decades-long scandal involving the FBI and its misuse of mob informants. Though it was an old case, would turning over these documents somehow have put FBI agents or these informants at risk? That's a valid question. Still, the President of the United States is rightly seen as the most powerful person in the world. The Founding Fathers felt it was critical we never forget that even the most powerful among us must be held accountable for their actions. In what ways did the framers of the Constitution try to balance the powers of the presidency with the rights of the people to know what their government is doing? Given the threat of global terrorism today, do you think we should broaden executive powers for the president and his senior staff? Why or why not?